Squadron leader David Campbell stood in a muddy field just outside Calais, staring at the twisted wreckage of a Messerschmitt Bf 109E that had crashed less than 2 hours ago. The German pilot was dead, his body already removed by French troops. But what Campbell was looking at right now made his hands shake. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Spitfire was the pride of the Royal Air Force, the most advanced fighter in the world. At least, that is what everyone believed. Until today, it is May 10, 1940, Germany has just launched Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Luftwaffe aircraft are swarming across the border in numbers that terrify Allied commanders. And in this field, British intelligence officers and RAF pilots are about to get their first close look at the aircraft that has been shooting down Hurricanes and Spitfires with disturbing efficiency. What they're discovering is changing everything they thought they knew about aerial warfare. Campbell had been flying Spitfires since 1938. He loved the aircraft. Its elliptical wings, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, its 8 Browning machine guns. The Spitfire was elegant, powerful, beautiful. British newspapers called it a technological masterpiece. Politicians gave speeches about how British engineering had created the finest fighter plane ever built, and Campbell had believed it. Until this morning, when he'd engaged a Bf 109 over Calais and barely escaped with his life. The German pilot had done things Campbell didn't think were possible. The 109 had climbed faster, dove steeper, and executed rolls at speeds that should have torn the aircraft apart. Campbell had fired at the German plane, watched his bullets connect, and then watched in disbelief as the 109 simply absorbed the hits and kept fighting. When Campbell tried to follow the German into a steep dive, his Spitfire's engine started cutting out. Negative G-forces the carburetor couldn't handle inverted flight. The 109 had no such problem. It dove away, and Campbell couldn't follow. But then, minutes later, another British pilot had hit the same 109 with a lucky burst. The German fighter had gone down trailing smoke, crashing in this field. And now Campbell was standing over its wreckage, examining its design, and feeling his confidence in British air superiority evaporate. Flight Lieutenant James Ellis arrived with a team of technical intelligence officers. Ellis was a trained engineer who'd worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment before the war. His job was to examine captured enemy equipment and assess its capabilities. He'd been expecting to find a competent aircraft. What he found instead shocked him into silence for a full minute. The first thing Ellis noticed was the engine mounting. The Bf 109's Daimler, Benz DB 601 engine, used direct fuel injection instead of a carburetor. This was revolutionary. It meant the engine could operate at any angle, any G-force, any orientation. The pilot could push the aircraft into negative G maneuvers without the engine cutting out. British fighters couldn't do this. Their carburetors would flood or starve during negative G flight, causing engine failure. This gave German pilots a massive tactical advantage. They could dive away from British fighters knowing the British couldn't follow effectively. Campbell understood the implications immediately. Every dogfight he'd been in, every engagement where a 109 had escaped by diving away, suddenly made sense. It wasn't pilot skill, it was technology. The Germans had solved a problem British engineers hadn't even acknowledged existed. Ellis moved to the aircraft structure. The 109's fuselage was built around a single main spar with stressed metal skin. This was lighter and stronger than the Spitfire's complex multi-spar design. The 109's wings were smaller, more compact. This meant less drag, better roll rate, and crucially, easier mass production. A Spitfire took approximately 15,000 man-hours to build. Initial estimates suggested the 109 took less than 8,000. Germany could build 2 109s for every Spitfire Britain produced. The armament was another revelation. The Fady they were examining had 2 Fe machine guns in the nose and 2 Fe MMG FF cannons in the wings, 20mm cannons. The Spitfire had 8 Fe machine guns. Ellis did the mathematics quickly. A single 2-second burst from the Fe's cannons delivered more destructive power than 20 seconds of continuous fire from a Spitfire. and the phase guns were mounted in the nose and inner wings, meaning they converged at a single point. The pilot aimed the entire aircraft, and all weapons fired through the propeller arc, devastating accuracy. British fighters had their guns spread across the wings, which meant the bullets converged at a specific distance, usually few yards. If you were closer or farther than that convergence point, your effectiveness dropped dramatically. The Fay had no such limitation. Every range was optimal. Squadron leader Michael Robinson joined the examination. Robinson was one of Fighter Command's most experienced pilots. With over Fay hours in various aircraft, he climbed into the Fay's cockpit, and what he found there disturbed him even more than the technical specifications. The cockpit layout was rational, efficient, combat-focused. Every control was positioned for easy reach during high-G maneuvers. The gun sight was simple but effective. The instrument panel was clear and logical, but the most significant feature was the canopy. It provided exceptional visibility. The German pilot could see in almost every direction. The Spitfire's canopy, while beautiful, had thicker frames and more obstructions. British pilots had blind spots the Germans didn't have. Robinson noticed something else. The phase control stick had weapon buttons positioned for thumb operation. The German pilot could keep his hand on the throttle and still fire his guns with his thumb. British fighters required the pilot to reach forward to press a button on the control column, which meant taking your hand off the throttle during combat. Another small advantage that added up, the landing gear was interesting. The phase gear retracted outward into the wings, attached close to the fuselage. This made the aircraft stable on the ground, but tricky to land. The Spitfire's gear was wider set, easier to land but more complex mechanically. Neither design was clearly superior, but the phase approach was simpler and lighter. Ellis examined the ammunition storage. The Fay carried Fay rounds per cannon and Fay rounds per machine gun. The Spitfire carried Fay rounds per gun across 8 guns, which sounded like more until you calculated firing time. The Spitfire could fire for about 16 seconds before running out of ammunition. The Fay could fire its cannons for about 7 seconds, but those 7 seconds were far more destructive than the Spitfire's 16 seconds. By mid-afternoon, a group of senior RAF officers had arrived from England. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh. Mallory wanted a full briefing on what had been discovered. Ellis delivered his assessment in a quiet voice that couldn't hide his concern. The BFA was not just competitive with the Spitfire. In several critical areas, it was superior. It could climb faster, dive faster, and fight at altitudes where the Spitfire's performance degraded. Its armament was more powerful, its engine was more reliable under combat conditions, and it was significantly easier to mass produce. The only clear advantages the Spitfire possessed were turning radius and roll rate at speeds below 300 miles per HR. In a slow-speed turning fight, a well-flown Spitfire could out-turn a 109. But combat was increasingly happening at high speeds and high altitudes, where the 109's advantages dominated. Lallery asked the question everyone was thinking. If the 109 was superior, how was Britain supposed to defend against the Luftwaffe? Ellis had been considering this question for hours. His answer was tactical, not technical. British pilots needed to change how they fought. They needed to avoid the 109's strengths and exploit its weaknesses. Never follow a 109 into a dive. Always force the fight into a turning engagement at medium altitude. Use altitude advantage whenever possible, and most critically, never assume that British aircraft were technologically superior just because they were British. This last point was uncomfortable but necessary. British aircraft designers had made assumptions about air combat that were proving wrong. They'd assumed dogfights would happen at medium altitudes and medium speeds, where maneuverability mattered most. The Germans had designed for high-speed combat at varied altitudes, where power and firepower dominated. They'd been right. Campbell raised another concern. The crashed 109 they were examining was an E model, the latest variant. But intelligence suggested the Germans were already testing improved versions. If the 109E was this capable, what would the next generation look like? And more frighteningly, what about German bomber escorts? The 109's range was limited, only about 410 miles. This meant German bombers attacking Britain would have minimal fighter protection. But what if Germany developed a long-range escort fighter with the 109's capabilities? Fighter Command would be overwhelmed. The examination continued into the evening. Every technical detail was photographed, measured, and documented. Sections of the aircraft were removed for shipment back to England for detailed analysis. The Daimler Benz engine was carefully extracted. British engineers needed to understand how the fuel injection system worked and whether it could be adapted to the Merlin engine. Flight Lieutenant David Crook, who had flown against 109s over Dunkirk, asked Ellis a direct question. Should RAF pilots be worried? Ellis's answer was honest and harsh. Yes, not because British pilots were inferior, but because they'd been trained based on assumptions that were no longer valid. Fighter Command's tactical doctrine emphasized formation, flying, and coordinated attacks. The Germans used flexible formations, aggressive individual initiative, and boom and zoom tactics that exploited their aircraft's strengths. British pilots flew in tight fire formations that looked impressive, but were tactically inflexible. German pilots flew in loose pairs, rotate formations, that allowed mutual support while maintaining individual freedom of action. When a German pair attacked, one pilot engaged while his wingman covered. British formations made this kind of fluid cooperation difficult. The pre-war RAF had trained its pilots to dogfight, to engage in close, range-turning battles where maneuverability was king. The Germans had trained their pilots in Spain, where they'd learned that altitude, speed, and surprise were more valuable than turning ability. German doctrine was, lose altitude, gain speed, attack, extend away. British doctrine was, close to gun range, maintain contact, maneuver for position. One approach was working, the other was getting pilots killed. As darkness fell, the officers gathered for a final discussion. What should be reported to Fighter Command headquarters? How should this information be communicated to operational squadrons? And most critically, what changes needed to be made immediately? Robinson argued for immediate tactical changes. British squadrons needed to abandon tight formations and adopt German-style fighting pairs. They needed altitude priority over everything else. They needed to stop chasing 109s into dives. They needed to treat every engagement as a high-speed slashing attack rather than a sustained dogfight. Ellis argued for technical responses. The Spitfire needed a better engine that could handle negative G. The armament needed upgrading to cannons. The production process needed simplification, so Britain could match German production numbers. These changes would take months or years, but they were necessary for long-term survival. Leigh-Mallory listened to both arguments and made his decision. Both approaches would be implemented. Tactical changes could happen immediately through updated pilot training and operational orders. Technical improvements would begin as priority programs, but there was a third element that worried him more than tactics or technology morale. British pilots and the British public believed the Spitfire was invincible. This belief was psychologically important, especially with the Battle of Britain looming. If pilots lost faith in their aircraft, their performance would suffer regardless of technical specifications. The information discovered today needed to be shared with operational squadrons, but carefully, pilots needed to understand the 109's capabilities without losing confidence in their own equipment. The solution was framing. The Bf 109 was a formidable opponent, yes, but it wasn't invincible. It had weaknesses that could be exploited. British pilots needed to fight smarter, not necessarily in better aircraft. The Spitfire was still an excellent fighter when used properly. It simply required tactics that matched reality rather than pre-war assumptions. Campbell understood what Leigh-Mallory was doing. It was the right approach. Panic would help no one. But he also understood the darker truth beneath the careful framing. Britain had entered the war believing its technology was superior. That belief was now proven false. The coming months would be fought, not with better equipment, but with better pilots using inferior tools to maximum effect. The technical intelligence report was written that night. Copies were distributed to Fighter Command headquarters, the Air Ministry, and operational squadrons. The language was careful, professional, and deeply concerning to anyone who read between the lines. The Bf-109E was described as a capable and modern fighter aircraft incorporating several advanced design features. Translation: we're in trouble. Specific tactical recommendations were included: maintain altitude advantage, avoid sustained diving combat, force the enemy into turning engagements below 15,000 feet where Spitfire performance is optimal. Never assume technological superiority. These recommendations would become the foundation of Fighter Command's defensive strategy during the Battle of Britain. The captured 109's engine was shipped to Rolls-Royce for examination. Engineers there were stunned by the fuel injection system's elegance. Work began immediately on adapting the concept to British engines, but development would take over a year. For now, British pilots would have to work around their carburetor's limitations. Supermarine, the Spitfire's manufacturer, received detailed reports on the 109's armament and began designing Cannon, armed Spitfire variants. But again, development and production would take months. The first Cannon Spitfires wouldn't reach operational squadrons until mid-1941, over a year away. May 10, 1940, was the day British confidence in technological superiority died in a muddy French field. The Spitfire wasn't obsolete, but it wasn't the invincible wonder weapon British propaganda claimed. It was a good aircraft with specific strengths and critical weaknesses, facing an opponent that was, in many ways, better optimized for modern air combat. The men who examined that crashed Bf-109 understood, something that wouldn't become public knowledge for years: Britain was going to fight the Battle of Britain with aircraft that were marginally inferior to their German opponents. British survival would depend on better tactics, better training, home field advantage, and radar, not better technology. Campbell flew his Spitfire back to England that evening. The aircraft felt different now. He understood its limitations in ways he hadn't that morning. The elegant, elliptical wings that had seemed so beautiful now represented wasted material and construction time. The 8 machine guns that had seemed impressive now felt inadequate compared to German cannons. The carburetor that had always worked fine now felt like a liability waiting to kill him, but he also understood his aircraft's strengths more clearly. The Spitfire could turn tighter than anything Germany had. At medium altitudes it was fast and responsive. Its visibility was good, despite the canopy frames, and most importantly, Britain had them. Not enough, never enough, but they existed, and they worked. The next morning, Campbell briefed his squadron on what he'd learned. He told them about the 109's capabilities, honestly and directly. Some pilots looked worried. Others looked angry that they'd been lied to about British superiority. Campbell told them something Ellis had said the previous evening: the aircraft doesn't win the fight, the pilot does. The 109 is a fine machine, but it is flown by men who can be beaten, and we're going to beat them by being smarter, more aggressive, and more determined than they are. It wasn't entirely true, technology mattered, but it was true enough to be useful. And in the weeks and months ahead, when RAF pilots faced overwhelming odds against a technologically superior opponent, that belief in themselves, rather than their machines, would make the difference between defeat and survival. May 10, 1940, was the day Britain's fighter pilots grew up. They learned that battles aren't won by superior technology alone. They're won by superior pilots, using whatever tools are available to maximum effect. The Spitfire wasn't the best fighter in the sky, but in the hands of pilots who understood its limitations and fought accordingly, it was good enough. And good enough, combined with determination and tactical intelligence, would prove sufficient to win the battle that mattered most. The crashed Bf-109 in that French field taught the Royal Air Force a lesson that would save Britain. Never assume your equipment is superior just because it is yours. Never stop learning from your enemy, and never confuse technological optimism with tactical reality. These lessons, purchased at the cost of shattered illusions, would guide Fighter Command through the desperate summer of 1940 and beyond.